44 men. That is how many sailors it took to crew a destroyer escort in the North Atlantic during World War II. 44 men operating a 200-ton warship designed to protect convoys from German U-boats in some of the most hostile water on Earth. The USS Mason, hull number D500T9, had 44 men in her crew when she left Boston Harbor. In March 1944, African-American sailors, commanded by white officers in a navy that had spent the previous 150 years relegating black men to the galley and the engine room, positions where they served food and shoveled coal, but never fired guns or navigated ships or made the decisions that separated a convoy from the bottom of the Atlantic. The Mason was different, not by choice. By experiment. The Navy had called it a trial, a test to determine whether black sailors could perform the technical and tactical work that modern naval warfare required, whether they could operate radar, sonar, and fire control systems, whether they could maintain discipline under fire, whether they could be trusted with a warship. The experiment had parameters. It had observers, and it had a conclusion already written before the Mason ever left port, because institutions that design experiments to confirm what they already believe rarely build those experiments to prove themselves wrong. But the North Atlantic does not care what the Navy believes. And on September 18, 1944, when a storm hit convoy NY-119 with winds measured at 60 knots and seas running 30 feet, the only thing that mattered was whether the crew of the USS Mason knew what to do when their ship started coming apart beneath them. They knew. The question is why it took the United States Navy 50 years to admit it. Before we get to the storm, you need to understand the machine that built the Mason, because nothing about what happened in September 1944 makes sense unless you see the system that created the experiment in the first place. The United States Navy entered World War II with approximately 100,000 black men in uniform. 95% of them were stewards' mates. They cooked, they cleaned, they served officers in the wardroom. The remaining 5% worked in engine rooms, ammunition holds, and harbor facilities, doing the manual labor that kept the fleet operating, but never commanding, never leading, never holding positions where decisions had to be made under pressure. This was not tradition. This was policy. Bureau of Naval Personnel Circular 48-42, issued in February 1942, explicitly restricted black sailors to the messman branch and general service roles. The restriction was justified in language that read like a medical diagnosis: limited trainability, insufficient temperament for technical work. Concerns about unit cohesion if black sailors were placed in positions of authority over white sailors. The people who wrote Circular 48-42 believed they were protecting the efficiency of the Navy. They were building a structural weakness that would show up in logistics, manning levels, and the operational flexibility of a fleet fighting a two-ocean war with fewer trained personnel than the Janshut situation required. By mid-1943, the manpower problem had become acute. The Navy needed destroyer escorts to protect Atlantic convoys from U-boat attack. It needed them in numbers that exceeded the available pool of white recruits who met the technical and educational standards for gunnery, sonar, and radar operation. Two choices: lower the standards or expand the pool. The Navy chose option 3, build a test case. In March 1944, the USS Mason was commissioned at the Boston Navy Yard with a crew composed almost entirely of African-American enlisted men, 53 ratings from seaman to petty officer, men who had scored in the top 15% of the General Classification Test, the Navy's aptitude assessment. Men who had completed technical training at Great Lakes Naval Station in Illinois, where they had been housed in segregated barracks, and trained on segregated equipment under instructors who had been told. This was an experiment. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander William Blackford, a white officer from Pennsylvania who had requested the assignment, not because he was interested in social progress, but because he wanted a command. Any command. The Mason was available. He took it. The executive officer was a white lieutenant named Elliot Schindler. The gunnery officer, engineering officer, and navigator were white. Every enlisted role, every technical rating, every man who operated the guns, the sonar, the radar, the fire control systems was black. The Mason was to prove whether this arrangement could function under operational conditions. The Navy had observers embedded in the crew. Performance reports were filed weekly. Every drill was evaluated. Every equipment malfunction documented. Every disciplinary issue forwarded to the Bureau of Naval Personnel for review. The experiment had a reporting structure more detailed than most combat operations. And then they sent her to sea. The North Atlantic in 1944 was a graveyard measured in tonnage. German U-boats operating in wolf packs had sunk over 2,000 Allied merchant ships since the war began. Convoy escort was the most tactically demanding and statistically dangerous assignment in the Navy. Destroyer escorts like the Mason were built fast, built cheap, and expected to last long enough to get the convoy across. Some did. Some ended up as depth charge targets for the submarines they were hunting. The Mason's first convoy escort mission departed New York on April 17, 1944. NY-115, 47 merchant ships bound for Liverpool. The Mason was one of 6 destroyer escorts assigned to screen the convoy from submarine attack. Standard procedure: sonar watch, radar contact evaluation, station keeping in rough seas while maintaining a search pattern designed to detect submarines before they reached firing position. Oh, the Mason's sonar operator, a 21-year-old from Chicago named James Dunn, detected a submerged contact on the convoy's eastern flank at 0340 hours on April 21st. He identified it as a probable submarine based on the acoustic signature, the speed, and the depth. He was correct. The Mason's executive officer initiated a depth charge attack. The U-boat broke contact and withdrew. The convoy continued without loss. Dunn's contact report was noted in the Mason's log. It was forwarded to Convoy Command. It was included in the after-action summary filed with the Commander Eastern Sea Frontier. And it disappeared into the Navy's assessment process, which was busy deciding whether the experiment was working. Between April and September 1944, the USS Mason escorted 9 convoys across the North Atlantic. She logged 23,000 miles. Her crew performed 47 sonar contacts, 3 of which were evaluated as probable submarines. She conducted 5 depth charge attacks. She maintained station in seas that damaged equipment on ships twice her size. She suffered 0 disciplinary incidents serious enough to warrant court-martial. Her performance evaluations from convoy commanders were consistently rated satisfactory to above average. The Navy's observers noted all of this. They filed their reports. And they were still filing when convoy NY-110 departed New York on September 16, 1944, 67 ships. Destination: Plymouth, England. Weather forecast: deteriorating. The forecast was correct, but it did not communicate the scale of what was coming. September 18, 1944, 1400 hours. Approximately 600 miles east of New York, still 1,200 miles from the English coast. The barometric pressure over the North Atlantic dropped 6 millibars in 3 hours. Wind speed increased from 15 knots to 40. By 1800 hours, it was 60. Seas that had been running 8 feet were now running 30. The convoy, which had been maintaining a compact defensive formation, began to scatter as individual ships lost the ability to hold course against the wind and current. The Mason, assigned to the convoy's port flank, was taking waves over the bow that were flooding the forward berthing compartments and damaging equipment on the main deck. At 2,100 hours, the ship's engineering officer reported to the bridge that the forward hull plates were buckling. The welds that held the deck structure to the hull were cracking under the repeated impact of waves hitting the bow at angles. The ship had not been designed to sustain. Dider escorts were built fast. They were not built to last, and the North Atlantic, in a 60-knot storm, was applying stresses that exceeded the design tolerances. Lieutenant Commander Blackford had a choice: break off from the convoy, head south to calmer water, and preserve the ship, or stay on station and risk losing the Mason entirely if the hull failed. He stayed, not because of courage, because of the mission. The convoy was scattering. U-boats hunted scattered convoys the way wolves hunted wounded prey. The escorts that remained on station were the only thing standing between 67 merchant ships and the submarines that German Naval Command had positioned along the convoy route. The Mason stayed for 36 hours. The crew of the USS Mason worked in conditions that turned every task into a test of endurance. Pumps ran continuously to clear flooding from the forward compartments. Damage control teams welded braces onto cracked hull plates, while the ship pitched at angles that made it nearly impossible to stand. Gunners lashed themselves to their stations to avoid being washed overboard. The sonar operator, James Dunn, remained at his station for 31 consecutive hours, listening, because a submarine in a storm had the same tactical advantage it always had. It could hear the convoy before the convoy could see it. And if Dunn missed a contact because he was too exhausted to distinguish signal from noise, ships died. He did not miss. On September 20th at 06:22 hours, Dunn detected a submerged contact approaching the convoy from the northwest. Speed 6 knots, depth 40 meters, acoustic signature consistent with a German Type 7 U-boat. He reported it to the bridge. The Mason's executive officer ordered a course change to intercept. In 30-foot seas with a damaged hull and a crew that had not slept in 2 days, the Mason turned into the contact and prepared to attack. The U-boat, detecting the approach of a destroyer escort, broke off and withdrew. No depth charges were dropped. No dramatic explosion. Just a contact that decided the risk was not worth the reward and left. The convoy continued. On September 22nd, the storm broke. By September 24th, convoy NY-119 reached Plymouth. 67 ships departed New York. 67 ships arrived in England. 0 losses. The USS Mason had stayed on station for the entire passage. Her hull was damaged. Her equipment was degraded. Her crew was exhausted. And the Navy's response to what they had done was a report filed by the convoy commander that described the Mason's performance as satisfactory, not exceptional, not commendable, satisfactory. The word you use when someone met the minimum standard. Here is what the report did not say. It did not say that the Mason had remained on station in conditions that forced 3 other escorts to break off for emergency repairs. It did not say that Dunn's sonar contact on September 20th had prevented a U-boat attack that would have killed sailors and sunk ships carrying fuel and ammunition that the Allied advance into Europe required. It did not say that the crew of the Mason had performed at a level equal to or exceeding that of any other destroyer escort in the North Atlantic Fleet. It said satisfactory, and then it moved on. After the war, the crew of the USS Mason returned to a country that thanked them for their service, and then enforced the same segregation policies they had left behind. James Dunn went home to Chicago. He worked for 30 years at a printing company. He did not talk about the war much. When people asked, he said he had been in the Navy. The USS Mason was decommissioned in 1945. She was sold for scrap in 1947. The experiment was over. The Navy had its data. And the conclusion the Bureau of Naval Personnel reached in its post-war assessment was that black sailors could perform technical duties under adequate supervision, but that full integration was not recommended due to concerns about morale and unit cohesion. Adequate supervision. As if the men who had operated the sonar, the radar, the guns, and the damage control systems for 36 hours in a North Atlantic storm had needed someone standing over them to make sure they remembered how. The data said something different, but institutions rarely let data overrule conclusions they have already committed to. It took until July 26, 1948 for President Harry Truman to sign Executive Order 9981, desegregating the United States Armed Forces. It took until 1994, 50 years after convoy NY-119, for the Navy to award the crew of the USS Mason a commendation for their actions during that storm, not the Navy Cross, not a unit citation. A letter of commendation signed by the Secretary of the Navy, acknowledging that the crew had performed with distinction under circumstances that merited recognition. 50 years. James Dunn was 71 years old when he received it. He attended the ceremony in Washington. He shook hands with the officials who presented the award, and when a reporter asked him what it felt like to finally be recognized, he said it felt late. Not wrong, not insufficient. Late, because the recognition that arrives a half-century after the fact does not change what happened in September 1944. It does not give back the 50 years when the story was not told, when the story, lessons, was not learned, when the next generation of sailors was trained under a system that had refused to admit what the evidence showed. The USS Mason proved in 23,000 miles of North Atlantic convoy duty that the Navy's restrictions on black sailors were operationally self-defeating. Every mile the Mason traveled with a crew the Navy had said could not be trusted was a mile that demonstrated the policy was wrong, but proof and acknowledgment are not the same thing. The Navy that built the experiment had already decided what it wanted the experiment to show. And when the experiment showed something different, the institution did what institutions do. It filed the data, wrote the report, and moved on. The cost of that decision was not only paid by the men it excluded. It was paid in the extended time it took to build a fleet that used all of its available manpower efficiently. It was paid in the slower operational tempo of a Navy that kept half its recruits in the galley when it needed them on the guns. It was paid by every convoy that crossed the Atlantic one escort short because the Navy had decided that the color of a sailor's skin mattered more than the content of his training. The USS Mason's crew did not just fight U-boats. They fought a system that had decided before they ever went to sea that they would fail, and when they succeeded, the system did not celebrate. It recalibrated. It found new language, adequate supervision, satisfactory performance, limited applicability. It found ways to say the experiment worked without admitting the policy was wrong. That gap between what the evidence showed and what the institution was willing to acknowledge is the space where injustice lives, not in the dramatic moments, in the quiet ones, in the reports filed and forgotten, in the commendations delayed by 50 years, in the word satisfactory applied to men who stayed on station in a storm that broke 3 other ships. If you want to understand how institutional failure works, study the language it uses when the evidence contradicts the policy. Study how it transforms proof into exception, how it rewrites success as adequacy, how it waits 50 years to say what should have been said in September 1944. The crew of the USS Mason saved a convoy. They proved a policy wrong, and the institution that sent them to sea took half a century to admit it. That is not a story about the past. That is a manual for recognizing the same pattern every time it appears, in every institution, in every era, in every place where the people protecting the system matter more than the people the system was supposed to serve. James Dunn spent 31 hours at a sonar station in a North Atlantic storm because he understood something the Navy's Bureau of Personnel did not. The submarine does not care what the policy says. It only cares whether you can hear it coming. He could. And 67 ships made it to England because of it. The rest is just the time it took for the paperwork to catch up to the truth.